You and I have known each other just for a little bit of time. Before we get going, I always love to ask people, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, who you are, what brought you into this industry, and what do you do?
I will keep this succinct because I've had a long and winding journey. Really a pleasure to join you. I'm really happy to be a part of it. Suzanne Bybota. I've been in the clinical development industry my whole career. And I happened upon it in a way that a lot of us will relate to. Had no idea what I wanted to do out of college, got a job at the hospital that was local to where I was living and was working for an MD PhD who was very involved in clinical research for his practice. Everything from having a lab in the university to conducting a lot of industry sponsored trials. And he came up to me and handed me a bunch of protocols and said, I need you to go open these and figured that out. And that kind of launched this whole one, oh, wow, this is what happens behind the scenes of drug development. And it was fascinating to me because it requires medical and scientific knowledge. It's also regulations based. You need to have a strong background in finance and budgeting and accounting. There are a lot of contracts and there's so many different things this touches and never get bored in clinical research. There just isn't a way to get bored. So my career has unfolded with that opportunistic beginning ever since. I've been at sites, I've been in the CRO world, I've been in large pharma, I've been in small scrappy biotech, I've been part of IPOs, acquisitions, and most recently now run my own consulting practice that's focused on kind of bridging the gaps in clinical research. So number one, helping sponsors navigate the world of IND through commercialization from an operations perspective. How do we operationalize a protocol? How do we get the right vendors on board for that protocol? How do we make sure that we have contracts and budgets that are truly aligned? How do we make sure that we're cost conscious and timeline effective? And how do we get to that milestone that we're aiming for? And on the services side, there's so many people, CROs, et cetera, that are trying to optimize their products and services into biotech and biopharma and don't necessarily have the subject matter expertise that they need to navigate what can look really complex from the outside. I'm talking to all these ClinOps heads. I'm not getting any traction. I usually know why that is, having been on the buyer side for as long as I have. Long story short, about 25 years in at this point, and yeah, still not bored.
As I'm listening to you, I'm laughing because almost every single person that I brought onto this podcast and I've asked that question, not a single person was like, I knew exactly I wanted to get into clinical research, right?
No.
Including myself. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And actually, I did a podcast with the guy that actually brought me into this, and he's like, I'm sorry, man, I apologize.
Everyone either loves it or hates it, but
Yeah.
everyone has that story.
Throughout your career, you've seen clinical trials from multiple vantage points, sponsor, CRO, operational leadership. What do people outside clinical operations consistently misunderstand about how clinical trials truly work?
Now you're going to have to keep me on schedule because I'm going to try to keep the answer simple. And I think it's how complex it actually is and how manual it actually is to run and oversee a clinical trial. We see it from the outside as, medical breakthroughs, scientific advancements, and they are 100%. We obviously wouldn't be an industry if we weren't built on science and medicine and advancing science and medicine. But there's a huge operational component to that. And I think that operational component, whether you're at a site, a CRO, a vendor, patient advocacy sponsor, you're going to feel this. The complexity with which we operate in this industry is far greater, I think, than anyone on the outside, but also anyone on the inside, but that's outside of the clinical trial space really realizes often. We're stitched together by the skin of our teeth, often by spreadsheets, by Word documents in track change form, by email threads that get too large for our inboxes. And that's normal for us. But for me, I think the biggest thing that people may misunderstand is just how complex it is and just how manual so much of it remains.
What's a good example of that complexity? You go from a vaccine study to an oncology or even a rare disease study. As you look at the lens of vaccines are fairly easy. Even sites will tell you, listen, like we can enroll all day long for
They will crank
free.
those out. Yeah.
But you get into oncology, rare disease, dose escalation, and
Yeah.
we really get into the weeds of those.
Yeah, every trial is different. I've spent a lot of time in oncology. I've done some of those vaccine trials. Yes, those are two really different hats, but they're solving different problems. In oncology, our patient population is so much more complex. These are sick patients usually that are, exploring a whole modality of different treatment options in addition to treatment. There's so much lifestyle change that comes from balancing a cancer diagnosis. So many concomitant medications. Our medical histories get so complex. Adverse event management is so critical and so difficult because these are now very complex patients that have been through surgeries, chemotherapies, radiation, some combination thereof to get to where they are when they enter a trial, regardless of whether it's a early phase 1 trial that's more altruistic in nature, or it's a late phase trial where that product is closing in towards approval. A vaccine trial is also complex. It's this dance of speed, frankly, and the churn that you go through at a site. Yes, they can knock those out really quickly, but it's a contest. It's a race. It's who can get that first patient in, but more importantly, who's going to get the last patient in. And how do you distinguish yourself in a crowded space? There are a lot of amazing clinical trial sites, SMOs that conduct these vaccine studies. How do you distinguish yourselves? How do you become the center that all the sponsors are going to want to go to? And then those trials are volatile. The sponsor says go, and you better have that population lined up out the door and around the corner ready to go. You better have your staff ready for that. So they feel really different. One is about speed and one is about complexity, but they have their own complexities depending on what it is you're working on at that moment. A lot of people focus on one therapy area. I've really enjoyed learning about a lot of different therapy areas. I love that I've worked in oncology and rare disease. I love that I've seen those vaccine trials. I love that I've worked in chronic diseases. I love that I've gotten to look at and touch so many different aspects of this world. And to me, that has made me much more versatile as an operator.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about the speed, right? You think of vaccines and people are like, why speed, right? But reality, some of these vaccines, they're only here for a period of time, and you need
Mm-hmm.
the patients in right now while the disease is around. We thought about COVID and other areas like South Africa, et cetera. So it's interesting that you think of that and you bring that forward. And to your point, even that speed has its own complexity. Can I get them in and out right away?
Exactly. I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize that we go through vaccine trials for our flu vaccine each year. And there are sites that gear up for that. They gear up just to do that because it's moving mountains. It's moving a ton of patients through really quickly and efficiently. Even my family, I have a lot of family in healthcare. My sister is a doctor. The amount that they understand often about what happens before that drug hits their prescription pad. It's obviously really variable. Some people are really close to research. They are really close to patient care. They're doing both. A lot of people are not. So I'm usually surprised. I live so deeply in this world, but I'm used to people not really understanding. And so right now, I probably start really high level, and then it depends on how they react. And that kind of governs where I'll go next. Is it I'm a consultant and I support a lot of different types of companies and I do this type of work? Or do I catch it as operations that's focused on drug development and kind of put the operations out front? Do I focus on how medicines get to market and that space between the lab and the pharmacy? It depends. I mean, I've had this conversation so many times over so many years with really sophisticated people, and it's rare to find someone who's like, oh yeah, absolutely. I completely get that. Or, maybe I have to tell a story about guinea pigs, or maybe I have to explain that I'm not a doctor or a scientist, that I don't work in a lab.
I'd love to dive a little bit. Listen, AI is around us from all angles. We can't escape
Yeah.
it.
Mhm.
Sitting where you are, how do you feel AI can help clinical trials today? And where do you feel the industry is expecting much too soon?
Yeah, I think that's really, really fair. I think life sciences, clinical trials, clinical research, even healthcare, we're classically behind in terms of technology. Even just going back in my own career journey, I remember working on paper. I remember the first EDCs. I remember everything coming in via fax, using IXRS systems that you had to dial into by phone. That is a long time ago, but we haven't gotten that far. And now all of a sudden, technology is exploding. We went from what is this AI business to AI everything. And I live here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I can tell you, driving up and down the freeway, every billboard is AI something or other. I think about, Scope, you mentioned Scope. I attended last year and everyone was hands off AI. This year, everyone was extremely enthusiastic about it. And we've also seen the number of vendors that are building within AI just explode over the past couple of years. I think this is a really interesting opportunity for the industry. I think there's a lot of efficiency that we can gain with using AI, but using AI in a thoughtful manner. AI is never going to replace human judgment, certainly not in an industry like this. We need to use AI in a manner that's compliant with regulations, that's compliant with audit trails. There's a lot of complexity when it comes to implementing it, but we've gotten a lot more sophisticated at what we can do. And I see a lot of opportunities to break down some of the barriers we see in terms of work processes and find efficiencies. Okay, so what does that look like? Right now, if we write a protocol, we'll get on a Zoom call, we will live drive through that protocol with 10 different people on the phone. We will send that protocol out on SharePoint or via email for cross-functional reviews. It's a really manual process. I think that's one huge opportunity that technology can help with. That's one tiny example of what this technology is capable of. I think one thing that's really interesting, and it's much more complex, is getting people on the same page. The CROs are operating off of their systems, sponsors have their systems. There's very little integration. And when I think of integration, okay, so we can all log into the same EDC. But we all know that's only one system that is really making that clinical trial run. And it's one piece of the puzzle. And we're often using many, many different systems. We may have a CTMS. There may be multiple CTMS systems, depending on what partners are involved. If we have an ePro device, we may be gathering data there that's going into a completely different dashboard. Analytics are something that this industry really struggles with. How far, is the site behind, in terms of activation? Or why haven't we gotten that patient from that other site? Or how much are we likely to incur in a change order? And I can't answer those questions easily. I have to make 6 phone calls and check 3 different spreadsheets and wait for someone to call me back to confirm something because I want to give a sophisticated answer. And that doesn't mean I won't come up with some beautiful slides to present exactly where things are. But all of that is really manual. And I don't have the same view of things that the CRO does, nor do I have the same view site has. I think the site gets really caught up in this. They're getting requests from all of these different people about all these different things. I think having some dashboarding and I think having some real-time analytics where we're all looking at the same single source of truth is one of the biggest opportunities in this industry. But I think if we look at any of the processes, if we look at clinical trials, the way that we contract with vendors, the way that we review the vendor RFPs, the way that we build protocols, the way that we interact with sites, the way that we contract with sites. I could go down a laundry list of things that are really painful in the industry that cause a lot of friction, that cause a lot of delays. Every time we start a new trial, we work with our CRO to come up with a clinical monitoring plan. Basically the same thing every single time. And we send it back and forth until finally someone signs off on it. I think there's a lot more efficiency that we can find across all of these processes. Look at data cleaning, for example. How much of that we do manually that we then pop into a spreadsheet that we then circulate through a team. I think there's a lot of opportunities. Is this a Band-Aid on top of fragmented systems, or is this something that we're truly going to integrate? And are we going to be able to integrate it across different partners with different business needs and different business models? I think it's going to take some time. I think we saw that with EDC. At first it was, wait, I had to put my data in a computer system? How's that going to work? That was awesome. I had how many different EDC logins? Every trial that I worked on had a different EDC. And now there are a few strong EDCs. So the market, I think, will start to select which of these platforms are the strongest, but it's going to take some time to do that.
I completely agree about how difficult it is from an analytics perspective. But I think also one of the problems, as we mentioned earlier, is trials are complex. There are no two studies the same.
Yeah.
Endpoints are different, right? So while you can have some static dashboards from the system, but then now we have to think about how do we customize these dashboards to fit the trial. But in order for me to do this, I have to understand what the endpoint is really supposed to look like and what the data. So there's a lot of complexity in there. I don't know that analytics will be solved anytime soon. I could be
And
wrong.
I'd agree with you there, Wessam. I would. I think that I don't see any CROs sharing their APIs with sponsors to get into their CTMF. I don't see that happening anytime soon. The amount of integrations that you'd need to build that would really enable that, we're not there yet. But I think what's cool about this space right now is that you can now start to picture what might be possible at some point.
Completely agree. So now I promised I wouldn't say anything that would embarrass you, but this one right here, if you were to design your own study, now with everything that you've learned and with AI coming in the picture, what would you do different today?
I'm not sure why this is going to embarrass me, but I'm ready for you. There are a couple things that I would focus on. I think the strategy has to be married with the execution. So I think as folks in clinical operations, whether you be on the CRO side, the sponsor side, you're often downstream of where a lot of those decisions take place. I think coupling thinking through what this will look like on the study execution side needs to be part of the strategy. What is the geographic blueprint? What are the right partners to go to? How do you structure a CRO contract so that it's going to be beneficial to the sponsor and clear to the CRO? And what are the opportunities to bring in technology if that is part of the strategy? And how do you offset the cost of your clinical trial? I think a lot of sponsors right now, especially sponsors that are very capital constrained, that are smaller to mid-sized companies without a product on the market, they look at bringing on a technology vendor, but that's more cost. But I would be looking at what would this technology do to offset my overall budget? Does it save me time? Does it streamline activities for the team? Does it make the work easier for the team? So I would be looking to implement technology where it made sense and where it would actually remove barriers to make life of the team easier. And again, that could be site, sponsor, CRO. I think that one of the things that often happens in clinical trials is the downstream impacts on sites. We don't consider that early and often enough. Or what is a patient going to think when they get into the study? Is this something that a patient is going to be able to manage? I've heard from sites over time how complex these trials have gotten. And for them, it looks like logins. It's how many different systems do I have to understand? Which labs are these? How does this differ from the last study, the last patient I saw? We need to remove friction from sites and make it easier for them to track and understand all of the different things that they need to track and understand. So bringing in sites to the picture earlier to make sure that we understand what's important from their perspective, how technology helps or hurts their workflows. As cliche as it sounds, we need to keep the patient at the center of what we're doing. There's so much we want to accomplish in a clinical trial, and they're extremely expensive. Well, do we need more visits? Do we need more labs? Do we need more biomarkers? And the answer might be yes, but we also need to consider whether or not we're making studies so complex or so burdensome for a patient that we're going to lose momentum in that direction too downstream. There are so many complexities country to country. What works in the US may not work elsewhere. A lot of people are taking studies ex-US sooner. There's so much work happening now in China, Australia, other parts of the world. How are we thinking about our global footprint in this trial? And really not thinking about each trial as an entity, but your whole development program, because each trial feeds to the next. And if you're starting from scratch each time and building your whole operational plan each time, the amount of lag that you're going to see because of that is significant. And then really, again, we need to do a better job, I think, at building partnerships, really seeing CROs, service providers, e-pro vendors, labs. These are partners in our trial. And there can be a lot of friction or animosity back and forth, and a lot of finger pointing that happens when things don't go right. And ultimately, that just slows us down. So setting expectations up front, whether that's internally at a sponsor or with your CRO partners or with different vendors, I think we need to be more thoughtful about that. I think sponsors are getting much more thoughtful about who they use for what. There's this inclination out there that all the CROs are bad. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there are amazing people at all of those CROs. But I think if you set that CRO up to fail and they're just spinning around the same thing and you're not course correcting, you're not adjusting, you're not looking at the contract, looking at the deliverables, really what is going on here, I think that can be a real bottleneck. And ultimately, the CRO, they're getting paid to work on your study, regardless of whether it's fast or slow. And a lot of times, the manual workflows, the turnaround time for documents, that can be a bottleneck too. I think there's a lot of opportunities here, but those are some of the things that I would lean into.
Usually there are some signals that can show us, hey, we're not going to meet the enrollment, patients are not getting better. At what
Mm-hmm.
point do you look as in, hey, this is an opportunity, a signal, a way for me to look whether this study is going to shift left or shift right?
I think that is an ongoing process. That should be something you're doing as you conceptualize that study with a team, and that you have to be doing throughout the entire study. I think startup can be a beast to complete, especially on a global study. But I think that's the first opportunity to see how things are going with the CRO and how you partner with them, how you partner with the vendors. Right there, before you even enroll a patient, is usually the biggest opportunity to make sure that everyone is really on the same page. Because once you really start activating sites and ramp up patient enrollment, you've kind of gone down a path that gets harder and more expensive to course correct. So I think the most important point to look at these things is early. And that's why feedback from the CRO, feedback from the sites, feedback from patients or patient advocates can be really powerful. But I think a lot of what we do in clinical research is we react. Oh gosh, I'm noticing that patients aren't enrolling in this portion of the country, or the sites aren't prioritizing the study. By the time we see that be happening, that doesn't mean we shouldn't course correct. It doesn't mean we shouldn't look under the hood. But I think the more we do up front to think down the road at what might inhibit sites, what might slow the CRO down, and think through how to solve those things. A lot of those things are operational. Have we thought through our clinical supply chain? Do we know how we're getting stuff in and out of countries? Do we know how we're going through contract reviews with sites? Those always take more iterations than you think. And if a site has to have that in place before they can activate, you're going to get stuck there a lot of the time. Are we properly compensating our sites, or are we being too stingy with how we go about that? There's a million different philosophies on how to do those things and what to outsource and what to keep in house. But again, it goes back to the complexity level. I think if you're not under the hood of these trials, you don't realize that each site of your 20 or 50 might need 6 revisions of that contract. The amount of pressure that puts on your legal team, if they're reviewing every single one, is massive. Making sure that you surface those things early on as potential risks.
That's
You can kind of keep track.
and that's what I was going to hone in. It's like, here's another set of complexities as well that we play in.
There's far too many for one podcast, frankly, to go into. I think you could just focus on risk reduction. You could just focus on startup. You could do the same at closeout. Frankly, those would all be separate episodes.
Yeah. Completely. I've had nightmares of closeouts, and I remember one study in particular where actually we spent the entire weekend in our office, and one of the guys slept under the desk. It was a nightmare, but thank God that's in the past now. What's one overrated industry trend?
That's a good question. I'm going to flip the AI conversation on its head, because I think that's maybe the best way to answer this. I think that there's this impression that AI is just going to fix everything. AI is the answer. And I don't think that's necessarily true, because I think we're cobbling technology on top of a broken foundation. And I really think that if we're overly indexing on technology to fix problems that really aren't technology problems, they're resourcing problems. They're the result of the fact that we do have a heavily outsourced industry, and we have so many different partners on any trial, that if we don't fix the foundation of the problem, the architecture of the problem, putting technology on top of it isn't going to solve that. And I think there's this impression that a new shiny tool will fix it. But I think that is overly indexing on what technology or AI is really capable of. I think we have to get to the root of the problems, and the root of the problems aren't technology.
This feeds into your LinkedIn post from earlier today.
But I think, look, I am pro technology. I write about technology, I use technology, but I think you can swing the wrong way and you can assume that technology is then going to fix everything. But I
Yeah.
think where the place we are in our industry was around long before there was ever any AI on anyone's mind. And I think it's going to take more infrastructure changes to get to the root of those problems.
Yeah, yeah, completely agree. I mean, listen, look, we're a tech company, but one thing that we did a few years ago, and honestly didn't realize that it was going to take off this well, but we deployed actual human beings in the trial because we see that sites are overburdened, patients don't have a way to engage. So we're now providing actual human beings into these studies to help provide the extra support. And it's been a bit of a game changer, honestly. Like some of the studies that we see and the patient conversations that we hear and we analyze, it's been interesting to say the
Absolutely.
least.
I think that's such a strong play because technology is only as good as the people that are using it. And when you're implementing new technology at a site, there can be this sort of overwhelm that comes with, oh my gosh, I don't know where this fits into my workflow. I don't know how to use it. I don't know what it can and cannot do. I don't know how I'm allowed to use it. But I think having people there that can help that process is really critical. And I've seen a lot of success from others that are doing the same for their technology platforms. In the mix is
Yeah.
always going to be important. And I know I said that earlier, but I think it's a good time to repeat that, especially
Yeah.
in this industry.
So what do you feel is an underrated operational focus in this industry?
I think something that's underrated is CRO contracts, really any contracting between a sponsor and a partner. These are never apples to apples. And sometimes I think there's this rush to pick a CRO and just to agree to whatever is there. But often, what's really important is to actually compare the apples to the oranges and to get under the hood of those contracts, really understand how they're billing, how costs are being incurred, how monitors use the hours that they're allocated. Are there costs in there that are duplicative? Are there costs in there that aren't necessary because another party is performing them? And then again, back to those things that people don't think of. Who is managing things like clinical trial supplies? Who is managing contract revisions or budget revisions that come in from all of these sites? I think there's this, the contract is what it is. They know how to do this. It's fine. And then there's this assumption that the CRO will just take care of everything. But the CRO is going to go by the letter of that contract. They are not going to take on anything that's outside of that, or you're going to be, out of scope. And I think the unsexy work is really analyzing those contracts to make sure that you really understand them, make sure that you really understand what you're signing up for, or you're signing your company up for, and make sure that the things that are not in that contract are things that you are able to absorb as an organization.
I have just two more questions. So one is, what truth about clinical trials do insiders truly understand, but the industry as a whole still struggles to admit it?
I'm going to double back on something I said before. If you hire a CRO, they're going to take care of your trial for you. The sponsor is ultimately responsible for any clinical trial on their clinical product. And ultimately responsible is a pretty big thing. Not just, hey, I'll check in with a CRO once a week and see how they're doing, but to really drive that trial, drive the program, oversee the program, and actually build relationships with your sites, actually understand what's working and what's not working. Oversight can come in a lot of different forms. It can be one CTM at the sponsor. It can be a big team of ClinOps folks that are really, really married to that program, and they're out at site visits, and they're participating or conducting their own investigator meetings. They're really hands on, and there's about a million different variations of that kind of a model. But I think outsourcing does not take you out of the picture. And we know that anytime we're going to have someone else do work for us, we know that we need to make sure that they're doing the right work. I think there's an over reliance on the CRO will handle it across the industry. And I think anyone that's working in sites CROs, clinical operations at sponsors knows that's not really the solution. And CROs want sponsors who are going to be active partners to them. And they need sponsors to kind of take the reins and direct and course correct. I think it can be a really great partnership, but assuming the CRO will handle it and then blaming the CRO the minute things aren't going well, yeah, it's a double-edged sword for, and frankly, for the sponsor too. I think that's one thing that this industry tends to accept, and that's it's not the most realistic expectation.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's almost like if you own a house and you hire a contractor, you're hiring the contractor to finish something, but it's really your responsibility to make sure that they're doing it exactly to your expectation as well. Follow up
Yeah.
with it.
Mhm.
Completely agree from that
Yeah.
perspective. Yeah.
Go ahead,
No,
please.
no,
Now, again, these are all topics I could talk about until I'm blue in the face. When I'm time constrained, that's tricky. Please go ahead.
yeah, yeah. No, I was gonna say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for engaging. As we close this out, I always ask one question at the end, which is,
Okay.
what will be one question you would ask that person? But before you answer that, the question that I have for you that somebody asked is, coming
Okay.
in here, what are your priorities?
Coming here, my priorities are to shed light on what happens behind the scenes, to shed light on all of the nuts and bolts, the manual nuts and bolts that these folks are dealing with every day in the trenches, at a site, at a CRO, at a sponsor, and to really highlight the fact that these are all incredibly bright, driven individuals, and the amount of work that they carry is immense.
Then what is your question to the next person that hops on to my
I
podcast?
like this. I would ask, where do you see clinical research evolving in the next 10 years? If we look at a trial 10 years from now, what would be different?
I hope they don't say AI.
They likely will, but then we'll have to ask them, what will AI be doing?
And it's interesting because innovation has been around forever. And honestly, I don't know that I've seen a whole lot of innovation in the last 10 years. It's been just the same thing, just getting cleaner and cleaner.
100%. We're very adverse to some forms of innovation, especially in this industry. Again, we're very highly regulated to some extent that makes sense, but we're also again spread across all of these different partners with different systems, different firewalls, different policies and procedures. It can be really tough to implement innovation across that kind of an ecosystem.
Well, Suzanne, thank you once again.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate the conversation and thank you for being here.
My pleasure.